All right. What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Where I'm at right now, it's 1:07 p.m., and today is March 16th, 2025, and we are continuing our Booked React series with Booked 9, Slave Breeding, Sex Violence and Memory in African American History. This book was written by Gregory D. Smithers, an esteemed history professor in the United States of America. And so this is actually part 7, I believe. Let me just double check. Yeah, we're on part 7, and we should actually be nearing the end of this book. We should be on, part 8, and then, finishing it up. But in our last live stream, we had technical difficulties with chapter 5. The live stream cut short about 30 minutes before I finished the chapter. So we're actually going to be finishing up chapter 5. I'm going to be rereading chapter 5 because to me, it's the most important chapter in the book. This book here is about the memory, how slave breeding is remembered in American history. And chapter 5 is actually the people that were interviewed before they died back in like the 1930s, who were formerly enslaved, talking about their experiences in slavery and what they remember about slave breeding, as getting as close to the truth as possible. To me, it was the most important and impactful chapter in this book. I believe that chapter should have been chapter 1 in this book, which is why we're going to be rereading it. Normally, I wouldn't do this. I would just try to continue on. But what we're going to be doing is finishing chapter 5 again, then reading all of chapter 6. Then we only have 2 more chapters left. We have 7 and 8, and then I believe there's an epilogue, and that's it. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing in this live stream. Watch the other previous live streams to catch up on the stories, and let's get to it. So we're starting here on page 126, which is where the live stream cut off last time. And remember, if you're in the comment section, let me know what you think about this book. Holla at your boy. Let me know what you think about any of these topics. And if you have any books that you suggest we read for this series, let me know and we'll try to get to them. Let's go. So, former slaves recalled in various detail the structures used by slave owners to foster slave breeding. Few offered as much detail as Rosa Stark. Stark, who was 83 years old when she was interviewed in Winsboro, South Carolina, recalled that her master, Nick P.A., owned 19 plantations and thousands of slaves. According to Stark, P.A. owned so many slaves that before the numerator got around, before the counter came, some more would be born or bought. The PA plantations were hives of capitalist activity and a site of human misery for the enslaved. But it was the misery of the enslaved that kept PA's plantations profitable. According to Stark, PA slaves were divided into a social hierarchy that comprised 6 tiers. The first classes amongst the slaves were the house servants. Below them were carriage drivers and gardeners, carpenters, barbers, and stablemen. Then come next the class of wheelwright, wagoners, blacksmiths, and slave foremen, followed by cowmen and the N-words that didn't have care, that cared for the dogs. So the black people that cared for the dogs were the lowest rung. Slaves in these classes, Stark remembered, all lived in good houses. This was the contrast to the bottom 2 slave classes on the PA plantation, which included the cradlers of wheat, the threshers, and the millers of corn, and the feeders of the cotton gin. Those were the lowest classes, according to Stark's tabulation. They was the common field N-words. So if you were like basically doing the agricultural work on the plantation, you were at the lowest level of work on the plantation, right? Going to my guy, Avery Adams, he says, I know this is a serious topic, but is this how the white women subconsciously got to see what we can do hands-on? Shout out to Avery Adams for jumping into the chat. Yeah, I mean, to answer your question, yes. We read the book, White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South, and there were quite a few instances of the slave masters, wife, daughter, nieces, cousins, whatever, sleeping with the black men that they saw out working in the fields. I know we might think this is like, a joke, or that's something that we think possibly could have happened, but no, it's been documented a number of times white servants who were working in the house with the white folks, because white folks back then didn't only have black slaves, they had white servants as well. Some of the white servants were getting down with the brothers. You feel me? It was widely believed at the time that black men did have larger penises and stuff like that. I mean, there were all sorts of myths and stereotypes surrounding the black body. So yeah, that is how some white women found out or saw a desirability in black men, right? So yeah, continuing here. By Stark's reckoning, the slaves were divided into classes according to their occupations, but the divisions of slaves according to employment also had a reproductive function, as Stark remembered it. A house N-word man might swoop down and mate with a field hand's good-looking daughter now and then for pure love of heart, but you never see a house gal lower herself by marrying and mating with a common field hand N-word, is what Miss Stark had to say about her experiences growing up on the plantation. So Stark's articulation of the house N-word, field N-word dynamic is common in African-American folklore. What is of interest to our understanding of memories about slave breeding is how she suggested that female house servants used their status among fellow slaves to put themselves and presumably their children in a position that would lessen the brutalizing physical effects of slavery. But this power, if we can call it that, was limited. For enslaved women forced to perform the role of breeding wench, the memory of slave breeding practices was equally horrific. Rose Williams, who insisted that her testimony were the facts, claimed that her master was very cruel. Williams remembered, he whooped us colored folks, and he worked their hands and feeds them poorly. Williams's candid testimony was indicative of those narratives elicited from former slaves by African-American interviewers. Indeed, the candor that perceptions of racial affinity fostered between former slaves and black interviewers was underlined when Williams offered her unprompted recollection of slave marriages. She informed her interviewer that at the age of 17, her master forced her to marry a fellow slave by the name of Rufus. As Williams remembered, I didn't like that colored man because he was a bully. Explaining her feelings towards Rufus, Williams claimed that she had no knowledge that her master had insisted on the marriage as a means of impregnating her and increasing the size of his slave population. When Rufus attempted to enter Williams's bed, she exclaimed in terror, What you mean? You're a fool N-word, a getting in my bunk." Williams insinuated that the violence and repeated episodes of rape following this incident left her unwilling to marry once slavery had been abolished. So this is a horrific incident, right? And this makes us have to think broader about what slave breeding was like, right? It wasn't just they just forced a guy and a girl in some barn in the back shed and told that guy to have sex with her and rape her, right, until she got pregnant. It was actually, hey, you know what, Sally Mae, you know what? You should marry Rufus. You get what I'm saying? Hey, little Williams, you know what you should do? You should marry Big Joe over there. You get what I'm saying? You two would make a lovely couple. You get what I'm saying? So there was a lot of coercion in what we would consider the marriages. I wouldn't even consider these marriages. These people were forcing these people to breed, right? Continuing here, Williams's testimony highlights the violence and oppression that former slave women often associated with slave marriages and reproduction. At the level of master-slave relationships, Williams provided insight into the hegemonic power that her master held over her, demanding that she marry a man she barely knew. At the level of the slave marriage or family formation, Williams recalled the gendered nature of her oppression and how her black husband physically and sexually abused her. Rufus, who was also enslaved, attempted to exercise what little masculine power he had on the plantation by raping Williams. Echoing the 1861 narrative of Harriet Jacobs, Rose Williams insisted that slavery fostered unnatural marriage relations between enslaved men and women that ignored the emotions of the parties involved. For former slaves like Williams, such memories highlighted a brutal but all too common form of breeding during slavery. Other former slaves, such as John Cole, linked the master's disregard for courtship and nurturing family networks among the enslaved to the debasement associated with the commodification of slave reproduction. If a hand were noted for raising up strong black bucks that would never let the monkey get them, meaning not getting sick, while working and hoeing in the field, Cole claimed, he would be sent out as a species of circuit rider to other plantations, to plantations where there was overplus of worthless young N-word girls. On these other plantations, Cole insisted, the black bucks would be married off again, time and again. Cole's implicit recognition of how slave owners devalued courtship and marriage among slaves was matched by his own perception of worthless young N-word girls, and a grudging acknowledgement of why such practices existed. This was thrifty, Cole insisted, and saved by any actual purchase of new stock. Indeed, when masters did encourage large families, as one former slave recalled, profit was the motive. So basically, as we spoke about in the previous live stream reading this book, a lot of the black men that were chosen to be breeders would have been considered like the, NBA players of today. These were the tallest, the strongest, the most athletic looking, biggest, tallest black men that they had on the plantation, right? And a lot of men, probably looked at this opportunity to get a little bit more food, a little bit more medical attention, better housing, as like a way to deal with their debasement and commodification under the system of slavery. So, I mean, think about it right now. Like if your boss at a low-end job, says you get a little bit more benefits by doing something that's sort of harmful to other people, right? You're going to look at that and say like, oh, this is an opportunity. Now, I'm not trying to say that the black men who were involved in slave breeding, right, as the bucks and studs are guilty because they were compelled to, they were forced to under the threat of the whip and the bullet. But it makes you think like, how does patriarchy work in a system where it allows men to, allow themselves to be a part of the oppression of their own people, right? It makes me think about like all these pornography companies like blacked.com and how essentially it's the same business, right? The white man says, hey, what would be cool, Jason Love? Why don't you go sleep with that little tiny white girl over there? Yeah, we're going to make, Jason, you're living such a good life, man. You get all the women around you. You're handsome, you're beautiful, you're big, you're tall, you're a strong buck. You get what I'm saying? Meanwhile, they make tons of money off of the exploitation of these black men, right? Live in front of us. And we all just sit there, right? Going now to the comments, Avery Adam says, in my mind, professional players today still slaves because they all get the same benefits. I mean, to some degree, right? We're all living under the system of capitalism where we're all exploited by our wages. And LeBron James does not make as much money as the owner of, the Lakers. You get what I'm saying? So yeah, it's still exploitation, but this is sexual exploitation where it even hurts our own people, right? Because you're having sex with a black woman at the behest of a white man to make him more money, right? And taking away all agency and freedom from that black woman. But let's continue here. Former slaves regularly alleged that profiting from the sexual exploitation of other human beings was a feature of slavery. Charlotte Martin informed a WPA interviewer that her former master found it very profitable to raise and sell slaves. Like Cole, Martin recalled the gendered nature of slave commodification. Martin insisted that she had witnessed her master select the strongest and best male and female slaves and mated them exclusively for breeding. She described a systematic form of reproduction, the slave master not only determining whom some slaves would have sexual intercourse with, but asserting his power directly over female slaves and indirectly over men by playing an active role in the reproduction of the slave population. Where plantation mistresses often played matchmaker to enslaved couples, Martin insisted that sometimes the master himself had sexual relations with his female slaves. Another slave remembered similarly, master had no children by white women. I ain't no man for telling, and that is the truth. At the time, it was a hard job to find a master that didn't have women among his slaves. That was a general thing among the slave owners. So, I mean, as we all know, rape was very common on the plantation from the studs and the breeders who were forced to, make black women pregnant, but also from the master himself, right? Okay, Avery says, hey, yo, so I can't watch Blacked anymore. I mean, you can enjoy Blacked.com. You can enjoy any type of adult entertainment you want. But I think we also have to remember, like all things in America, in our culture, right, are influenced by capitalism and white supremacy, and especially our history of enslavement, right? That informs how many of our institutions and things we see in our culture are created, right? And so Black.com, to me, let's keep it real, Black people don't own Black.com. Black people didn't own ghetto gaggers. They didn't own all the other companies, browsers, all the ones. You know what I'm saying? And I can't even think of all the other names. Bang Bros, all the stuff where black men perform at a very high level because of their physical attributes, and to the enjoyment and benefits of white people who watch it. Meanwhile, those black men make pennies on the dollar. You get what I'm saying? That's exploitation, and I don't think it's that different from the slave breeding that was done back in the past. Uh, I think that's just how you have to see it too. I mean, how is it any different? How is it any different? Y'all inform me. According to former slaves, slave breeding practices involved sexual exploitation, marriages unrecognized by law, and often the sale of kith and kin. There was a crude logic to the narration of these memories that one former slave summed up simply: kill an N-word, breed another. Former slaves narrated memories not simply of human beings being bred and sold like cattle, horses, and cows, but of slave owners and their slave traders having the power to determine when life should be conceived and, if necessary, ended. In the memories of former slaves, nothing embodied the immoral power of the slave owner and the slave trader more than the auction block. The road to the auction block, where human chattel was inspected, bought, and sold, was fraught with physical terror and emotional uncertainty. Dave Harper, recalling his life as a slave in Missouri, claimed, "I've seen slaves go through Danville in droves like cattle. They was chained together and they walked them to St. Louis to the N-word yard." This type of forced march was exhausting, and some slaves found it difficult to complete the journey. The punishment for being unable to keep pace with the slave coffle, Harper claimed, often caused mother and child to be separated. One mother give out, he remembered seeing, the man in charge made her give her baby away. She couldn't carry it no further. Someone near Danville raised the baby. So that's crazy. That's crazy. Avery Adams says, yeah, I never looked at it that way. I mean, it's just, yeah, that's how we should just have a critical eye on everything we see relating to us as black men in the media, and our situation in America and also in the world as well, because a lot of how blackness was created was through slavery, was through this institution that lasted through 400 years. There was no niggas until they made the nigga. You get what I'm saying? But let's go here. This is very interesting. I mean, this is crazy to think about. A woman is marching across state lines. Imagine marching from Texas to Kansas, right? And you're going to be sold, and you're carrying your baby, and the slave driver, the white man on horse, left behind in such a manner. Pethy claimed she was 6 weeks old when she was sold. Forcibly estranged from her birth parents, Pethy remembered that awful sight of slaves being led to market. I sure remember those days, she told her interviewer. I seen people handcuffed together and driven long to Williamsburg Road like cattle. Adding to the popular imagery of upper South states breeding slaves for sale in the lower South, Pethy noted that they was bought to be took south, lest the truthfulness of her testimony be questioned. Pethy emphasized that I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters sold, and we never did see them again, right? So this is why black folks have family reunions. This is why we are the community that created the family reunion, because no other group of people other than maybe the Jews have gone through this much. Maybe the Crimean Tatars, when the Russians forced the Crimeans to move from their homeland in Crimea to like far eastern Russia. But black folks under slavery created the family reunion because our sisters and brothers were sold and we wanted to get back with them after the abolition of slavery. Former slaves, memories of slaves being led to the auction block, inspected and bid upon, were graphic reminders of how the commodification of human life was soul-crushing to observe. Annie Bridges recalled, my mother told me that they used to sell the little children away from the breast of the mothers. Fannie Berry, who insisted that us colored women had to go through a plenty, I tell you, recalled such distressing scenes in Petersburg, Virginia. She remembers seeing young gals being marched down the train. Baby, baby, I can recollect it, Berry claimed. A terrible time, too, it was. Berry was traumatized by a great crying and carrying on amongst the slaves who had been sold. 2 or 3 of the girls had young babies taking with them. Poor little things. As soon as they got on the train, this new master had the train stopped and made them poor gals, mothers, take the babies off and laid them precious things on the ground and left them behind to live or die. So this is crazy. The slave master is marching a bunch of slaves to a whole nother state, forcing them to walk, right? Because when she says train, I imagine not a train, choo-choo. It's like a actual train of people marching for hundreds of kilometers to be sold. And the slave driver says, hey, black women, y'all carrying your babies, put them on the ground. Put them on the ground and we're going to keep walking. Now, this sets up the scene for a hilarious story that could happen. Imagine you're a poor white living in the deep South and you're marching through the marsh, the swamp, the forest one day, foraging for food, and you find a bunch of black babies on the ground. You just hit the gold mine. You just hit the gold mine. Imagine Jebediah, the old Southern poor white cracker, finds a bunch of Negro babies on the ground. He said, Mama, we rich. We made it. Moving on up to the top. We moving on up. Somebody make that a movie. Somebody make that a movie or a book. I would make that a book and I would make it a comedy. It's a comedy. The Rich White Man. What was that show back in the day about those old hillbillies from West Virginia that struck oil in their backyard and then they moved to like California? Oh, the Beverly Hillbillies. Yeah, that's what it was. The Beverly Hillbillies, but this time they get rich off of finding abandoned black babies on the ground. All right, continuing here. The narration of such scenes highlighted the cruelty that former slaves often associated with breeding during slavery. Narratives about the commodification of slave family members were tied together by the economics of slave raising and selling, a process that the formerly enslaved felt began on the plantation and was perpetuated by the technology of turnpikes and rail lines and by the printing press's production of advertisements for slave auctions. Berry observed how slave breeding intersected with such technologies, insisting matter-of-factly that when babies were left that way at a train station, they didn't belong to nobody, and some poor white man could take them and raise them up as his slaves and make them work on his plantation if he wanted to and sell them. See, I knew it happened. I knew it happened, right? So I was wrong about the train stations. They actually did use trains to transport slaves, okay, but they also made people walk for miles too. I mean, we know that happened as well. So while poor whites did not participate directly in this stage of the breeding process, the memories of former slaves like Berry suggest that whites of all socioeconomic statuses benefited from the commodification of Black life. In the absence of written or statistical evidence, it would be easy to dismiss such recollections. Certainly, as the years aged bodies and fragmented the memories of former slaves, a coherent narrative of one's personal history became difficult to articulate. But moments of intense trauma and stress tend to stay with the individual even as the fog of old age descends. Basically, what they're saying is like many of the people that were interviewed in the 1920s and 30s about their times being enslaved, and slavery ended in 1865 and something like that. These people were hella old, right? And they lived through so much, right? So yeah, it's hard to talk to your grandpa today in 2025 and get a coherent story about his life. Imagine talking to somebody who was illiterate most of their life and lived in slavery, but yet and still traumatic moments live in our minds regardless of what happens, right? You'll remember the time you got shot. You'll remember the time, you were raped or abused, no matter how old you were, right? So take, for example, Jane Simpson. While Simpson was weakened by old age and illness, she insisted on telling her experience of slavery, even if it was presented scattering-like. Her narrative of the past was disjointed, but the trauma she expressed about witnessing people being sold like cattle left an indelible mark on her soul. Simpson thus used direct and simple language to state unequivocally that I've been sold 6 times in my life. I've been sold 6 times in my life. James Simpson was not alone in sharing such memories. Israel Massey referred to slave owners, overseers, and slave traders as dirty suckers. His bitterness was born out of a moral disgust for the degradation imposed on African American people on the auction block. He explained, while a slave standing on the block, the old auctioneer would say, strong N-word, good color, good worker, who'll buy $100, $100, $100, $200. Now, you're getting sold for $100. I don't think you're that strong of a buck. Oh, it's 500 over here, baby. I'm joking. That's really bad. That's a horrible joke. But yeah, this is traumatic. Massey's recollections suggest that slave auctioneers focused on the physical proportions of the male slave and his promised capacity for physical exertion. These qualities had implications for slave breeding purposes. But it was not until enslaved women stood on the auction block that Massey highlights the link between the slave auction and breeding practices. He stated, if it's a woman, say pretty much the same. They say sometimes, fine wench, good breeder, and the like. Massey could not avoid dredging up such dark memories, the trauma they appeared to embody in this memory being evidenced in the brevity with which he ended his discussion of the auction block. Other former slaves recalled the auction block and sale in more vivid detail. J.F. Boone, a former Arkansas slave, recalled that a healthy breeding age slave could fetch as much as $500. Boone remembered that slave traders and auctioneers would put up N-words on the block and auction them off. They auctioned off N-words according to the breed of them, like they auction dogs and horses. The better the breed, the more they pay. Snuvy Jackson took a blunter narrative approach to slave breeding in the auction block. Recalling slave life in Virginia, Jackson echoed the words of the antebellum abolitionist, stating, Virginia was a slave breeding state, and N-words were sold off just like stock. Families all broke up and never saw one another again. Virginia was a slave breeding state. I mean, we spoke about this in a previous chapter. Basically, the deep, deep South, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Florida, right? That's where you went to work until you died on a sugar plantation, picking cotton, tomatoes, potatoes, wheat, whatever, right? Whatever they're growing down there, right? But in Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, because Virginia was sort of one at the time, Tennessee, you know what I'm saying? Places where they didn't have good land, those were states where slave breeding was more common, where the slave master would have sex with a black woman to sell his own children. A slave master would have sex with his black slave woman to sell his own children, and he would forcibly make his slaves get married in those states so that they have children and then they could be sold downriver, right? Very traumatic stuff. Very sick stuff to even think about, right? But this went on for a good 400 years. Memory, history, and the Black family. The language used in the 1930s to describe traumatic episodes of sex and violence and slavery was influenced explicitly and implicitly by the rhetoric associated with Black Christianity, early 20th century racial science, the chauvinism of Black nationalism, and the ongoing pursuit of stable, nurturing Black family units. Michelle Mitchell's insightful book, Righteous Propagation, makes similar points in the context of racial uplift, the politics of respectability and racial destiny among Black Americans at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. According to Mitchell, advice manuals and conduct tracts married the language of sexual propriety and racial science with the self-help ethos that was pervasive in African American culture. Advice manuals emphasized, among other things, the importance of exercising restraint in both public and private behavior. As Mitchell succinctly characterizes the message of this literature, morality, thrift, and hard work were essential to Black progress. So basically what they're saying here is like, respectability politics was in vogue in the 1930s, right? I mean, that was a very conservative time in America. That's when we had the traditional family roles. Men were men, women were women, right? And also Christianity played a big part in society. So there was a lot of cultural conservatism that permeated all of America, but really deeply to Black folks, because as we know, people that tend to be less educated and have less social mobility tend to be more religious as well. And so, religion was informing Black folks. And also at the same time, there was this idea that Black folks need to be better than what they think our race is, because of what we went through, the traumatic stuff that we went through, and also how the white society viewed us as well, which is why a lot of Black folks, back then were saying, no sex before marriage, you need to be clean and stuff like that. We have the joke, or it's the meme, that Black folks use the wash rag and white people just put the soap on their skin and stuff like that. And that's because, we take cleanliness, we take personal hygiene, we also take, sexual mores very seriously. You get what I'm saying? Like, if you're my age, you remember when people said Black girls don't suck dick and Black dudes don't eat pussy, right? Because that was considered sexually immoral, twisted, backwards, and stuff like that, right? Used to be the joke that the white folks did stuff like that. White folks, you would put it in their butt, you could get some head, all that sort of stuff. But it didn't used to be that you would consider Black folks as being like the type to do sexual activities like that. At least that's how it was talked about. Now, of course, people of course, were eating ass and getting their dick sucked and all sorts of stuff. You get what I'm saying? But it wasn't like that in how we spoke about it. You get what I'm saying? And that was from my age. And I'm from Louisiana, born in 1990. You get what I'm saying? So yeah, continuing here. Imagine back in the 1930s is all I'm saying. Oh yeah, so since the 1970s, historians of the slave family have emphasized just how proactive enslaved parents were in teaching their children lessons in personal morality, hard work, family loyalty, and revealing how to deflect questions about paternity. In this historical context, former slaves remembered the domestic slave trade as a critical structure that exploited Black bodies and fragmented families. The former slave W.L. Boast said it best when he claimed, "If they put up a young N-word woman, the auctioneer cry out, 'Here's a young N-word wench, how much am I offered for her?' The poor thing stand on the box, a shivering and a shaking, nearly froze to death." Boss concluded. When they sold, many poor mothers begged the speculators to sell them with their husbands, but the speculators only take what he wants. So maybe the poor thing never see her husband again. In other words, former slaves recalled just how important marriage was to them and to their ancestors during slavery times. Going out to the comments. Avery said, I heard that before too. Yeah, sexual mores have changed, right? A lot has changed. I believe if you're a millennial and you at least remember, before the internet, you remember a lot of things being different. How we spoke about gay people, how we spoke about sex. It was a scandal when Bill Clinton got his dick sucked in the office because at the time that was taboo. It was taboo to even talk about oral sex. You know what I'm saying? Shit like that. But continuing here. Another thing I got to say here is that, as this former slave, W.L. Boast, is talking about, we imagine marriages under slavery to be sort of consensual, and that these marriages were, between two people on the plantation who happened to fall in love and tried to form some type of family unit under slavery, which I'm sure happened to some degree. But but as we heard the other slaves talk about, marriages were set up by the master. White people didn't recognize Black people getting married legally. And, if the master did condone a marriage, it was for the explicit purpose of breeding, right? So it's not like how we romanticize certain aspects of our history, or our ignorance allows us to fill the blank, saying that that's what it was probably like. Like the marriages that we saw our parents or grandparents have are the same types of marriages that existed under slavery. It's not the same thing. All right, continuing here. Narratives that emphasize the importance of marriage were often reinforced by the memories of religious conversation. Religious narratives invariably incorporated commentaries about the importance of sexual propriety and family support networks. Former slaves regularly claimed that God entered their lives shortly after a parent or loved one was sold away. According to former slaves, the separation of enslaved children from their parents was a sin committed by whites who lusted after wealth at any cost. In the narrative retelling of such unscrupulous money-making endeavors, former slaves refused to present themselves or their families and friends as willing participants in such sinful schemes. One former slave recalled that God started on me when I was a little boy, grieving from his mother who had just been sold away. This particular slave insisted that God helped to deliver his soul from sin, thereby ameliorating the pain felt after the loss by sale of his mother. There existed no greater sin in the minds of former slaves than the sexual exploitation of Black people and the separation of family members during slavery. To counter the emotional pain contained in such memories, former slaves differentiated their own morality from that of masters. The narrative of the religious conversation contained within it the antidote of the immorality foisted on African Americans by sexual violence and coercive breeding practices. The discovery of God's love through the love of a spouse and children. One slave who remembered being sold as so much property at the age of 14. 14. Let's remember, like slavery, it was not grown-ass big Black men. You get what I'm saying? These were children. These are what we would consider middle schoolers. You know what I mean? Early high schoolers by today's standards. When they had a slave on the auction block and said, this boy here is a good breeder. You know what I'm saying? They're talking about a 15-year-old boy that you can sexually exploit to make more slaves for you, right? Continuing here. So one slave who remembered being sold as so much property at the age of 14 linked slave owners and slave traders to the devil and countered these early evil forces by emphasizing the love that comes with prayer and the love of one's family. Accordingly, this former slave recalled, "All of my family were God-fearing, and I came up in an atmosphere charged with faith, hope, and the Holy Spirit. Outwardly, we sung, inwardly, we prayed." Treated like animals, raised and sold like livestock, African Americans felt that the interlocking social, economic, and cultural structures that made slave breeding and the internal slave trade possible contradicted by the word of God. At the same time, memories of sexual violence and family separation shaped late 19th and early 20th century attitudes about the importance of sexual propriety and marriage in contemporary African American life. Interracial sex and interracial marriage were particularly frowned upon. Francis Bastard, interviewed in Nashville, Tennessee, declared that, "I don't believe in white and black marriages. My sister married a light man. I wouldn't marry one if she turned me into gold, or if I turned her into gold," or something like that. Julia King, interviewed in Toledo, Ohio, shared these views. She labeled slavery a terrible system, adding, "I think slavery is the cause of mixing. If people want to choose somebody, it should be their own color. Many masters had children with their Negro slaves, but the slaves weren't able to help themselves." Now, we spoke about this before because this topic came up in Martha Hodes's book about interracial sex in the, antebellum South. There are many reasons why Black folks might have been against interracial marriages or expressed the opinion that they were against it. My own grandmother said she didn't like interracial marriages and stuff like that. My grandmother on my mother's side, I didn't hear her exactly say this, but I heard this from my cousin who spent a lot of time around my grandmother, and I spent a lot of time around her as well. But anyway, a lot of Black folks didn't approve of interracial marriages for one. Number one, they didn't want white folks acting up. They didn't want, some snow bunny or some Connor or John coming down to the Black part of town to, shack up with somebody, and then the white folks come and burn down the whole neighborhood. That's number one. So that's maybe why Black folks said they didn't approve of interracial marriages. Secondly, there was this belief that Black folks, even speaking about this, could have a target on their back. So we're not supposed to be expressing this sort of thing. And thirdly, a lot of Black people internalized at the time the ideas that were prevalent in society that people need to stick to their own color, race, ethnicity, whatever it may be, because that was prevalent in the white society as well. We have to remember that any time that we exist as Black folks, the majority of us are going to consume, inhabit, live in, believe in the dominant ideas of the dominant society. We are going to believe in what we think is what is natural for us as Black folks, because that's what we see the white man do in general. Continuing here, memories of coercive interracial sex during slavery no doubt shaped the sexual attitudes of former slaves. These attitudes articulated in an era when a diverse range of Black leaders, from Booker T. Washington to Marcus Garvey and Josie Briggs Hall, counseled self-help, racial pride, and sexual modesty, were designed to place a degree of narrative space between the memory of sexual violence during slavery and the racial stereotypes that white Americans used to label Blacks as sexually promiscuous. According to many former slaves, it was the system of slavery and the white men and women who oversaw its immoral operations that were the true sinners of the flesh. And that might be another reason that Black folks really disapproved of interracial marriages or sexual relations between the races, because they saw the white man do this all the time. So they have a negative perception. If your grandmother or your mother or you were literally raped by a white slave master, you're definitely not going to be fond of people saying, yeah, it's okay to just, lay up with the other side. You get what I'm saying? There's a certain level of trauma, right? Which is why, it's understandable certain people, have certain phobias or dislikes about certain things because of the traumas that they went through, right? If you had food poisoning one time from eating shrimp, nobody's going to fault you for saying you don't like shrimp or seafood in general. Continuing here, a sense of moral propriety and uncertainty about the paternity of some children prevented former slaves from divulging too much information about the sexual contact between enslaved women and white men. Such propriety was born of a collective memory of slavery's sexual excesses against enslaved women. It also reflected an awareness of early 20th century anti-miscegenation attitudes and laws, and an acknowledgement that white missionaries and white Americans generally associated African Americans with immoral piety in the years immediately after the Civil War. Aware of these racial perceptions, Black Americans learned that they needed to choose their words carefully, especially in the company of whites. This was particularly true of discussions about racial violence and sex. Caleb Craig, for instance, instructed his interviewer that older people were mighty careful of the words they let slip out of their mouths. Rhetorical caution, combined with the use of religious language, helped former slaves craft moral commentaries about the importance of sexual propriety. These narratives reinforced a general distaste among former slaves for interracial sex and interracial marriage. Choosing his words carefully, Frank Bell, interviewed in Vienna, Virginia, presented a moral tale on racial violence and slavery that was as much a commentary on early 20th century racial and interracial sexual relations. Bell spoke cautiously about the origin of mixed race people in Virginia, stating, "Well, I ain't saying the master did, and I ain't saying he didn't, because they were many little white-skinned N-word babies that grew up on master's plantation. But ain't nobody knew for certain if those children were his or not. Leastwise, I ain't know." Basically, this guy was saying, I ain't snitching, but there were a lot of Tiger Woods and Obamas running around. And the only one having interracial sex a lot was the white man. But I don't know who did it. I don't know where they came from. Anyway, Bell's cautious approach to the issue of sexual coercion in slavery was justifiable. In Jim Crow America, Black men were wise to avoid explicit discussions about sex, much less interracial sex, lest they risk falling victim to the lynch mob. As with so many other former slaves, Bell's awkward commentary about violence and sex framed broader social anxieties about racial identity and social change in America. Beginning, as we have seen, with the Civil War and Reconstruction, the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought social change to the United States on a seemingly unprecedented level. Former slaves expressed mixed feelings about the impact of these changes. John B. Elliott, a former slave who went on to become a minister in Columbia, South Carolina, expressed amazement at how well former slaves adapted to the immediate aftermath of slavery. Reflecting on his transformative era, he recalled, when I think of the 60s, 70s period, I'm surprised that recent slaves, suddenly placed in administrative positions of honor and trust, did as well as they did. Others were less sure about the positive effects of the Civil War and Reconstruction era. Lewis Lucas, who relied on old age assistance to sustain himself, recalled that the abolition of slavery changed Black people. He felt that there is a big difference between the young people now and what they used to be. The old folks ain't the same neither. It's always the same. Every generation, literally, generation after slavery was saying, these new whippersnappers, they ain't like us. They ain't like us. These young folks don't know what it's like to work half naked all day in the sugarcane fields. They don't know what it's like. And then the generation that was born after the emancipated generation, they say they don't know what it's like. They ain't like us. You know what I'm saying? And then what happens every single time? Every single time. Every generation thinks they're the best and they have it the hardest and that no one else is like them, right? And all of this always is proven false until we make it to Gen Alpha. Until we start watching Skibbity Toilet, until you start watching Skibbity Toilet and getting like, I don't know, PewDiePie is on the level of Gen Alpha. Maybe he's Gen Z. It ain't my generation. It ain't mine. You get what I'm saying? I grew up on SpongeBob at least. We didn't at least become autistic. We didn't. We had Fairly Odd Parents, SpongeBob. We rode bikes. We played video games. We didn't have the internet. We had Nokia flip phones. Our generation was lit. Millennials are lit. We might be cringe. Millennials might be cringe as hell. We might not know how to use the internet well. We might be grown-ass adult. We might be grown-ass kids. All of us secretly inside are like Seth Rogen and Jonah Hill, but at least we had a trill-ass upbringing. Gen Alpha, we can't fuck with them. Gen Z is okay. Gen Z is not as bad as I used to think they were, but Gen Alpha is doomed. They're doomed. We're all doomed. We're all doomed. Gen Z, the only problem with Gen Z is that they're becoming Nazis. All of Gen Z hate women. They hate trans folks. They just love everything that's evil in this world. They want to like Sig Heil. That's the only problem about Gen Z. I don't know what happened. They didn't have magic school bus to teach them that Nazis bad. I don't know. Anyway, continuing here. While former slaves grappled with the significance of change over time, the narratives about religion, morality, and family were interwoven to produce an insistence that even amid the immorality of slavery and coercive breeding practices, Black families strove to unite men and women, the young and the old, and to create nurturing home and extended kin networks. These narratives downplayed and often overlooked the violence and dislocation that historian Clarence Walker identifies in slave families and communities. This selectivity of memory, however, served a didactic purpose. One former slave, for example, recalled that most slave parents tried to teach their children to be mannerable. Sylvania Durant recalled the lessons instilled in her by her father. Honey, Pa always said that you couldn't expect no more from a child than you put into its raising. Corporal punishment was part of the raising of slave children during slavery, just as overseers and masters used the lash to discipline adult slaves. For example, former slaves recalled seeing enslaved parents give their children an unmerciful lashing for breaching family codes of conduct. Slave parents also counseled teenage children, especially girls, about courtship, love, and sex. While slavery had a major impact on enslaved families, on the issue of family morality and the cultivation of a nurturing home environment, former slaves tried to connect Black America's pre- and post-abolition commitment to strong family units. Even amid the violence and sexual exploitation that tinged narrative recollections of slavery, some former slaves emphasized the determination of parents to raise children according to the dominant moral standards of the day, standards of courtship, intimacy, and sexual conduct that white Americans applied only to themselves. One former slave insisted that despite the restraints imposed on his parental authority, I am one man that do love my children. A former slave by the name of Mary Teal explained, Pa made us go clean. He made me comb and he wrapped my hair every night. I had pearly hair then. So yeah, I think a lot of Black folks grew up getting whoopings. I got whooped. Daddy whooped me. Mama whooped me. Got whoopings, not all the time, but I got my fair amount. You get what I'm saying? And I remember gaining some level of consciousness. And then when I understood I was Black and I understood how Black folks got to America, when I understood basically the overview of slavery, what happened, whippings, chains, all that sort of stuff. And then when I got a whooping after I got that consciousness, I said, oh, we're really repeating what the slave master did to us. Like my first consciousness of coming into my Blackness was seeing the negative aspects of the remnants of slavery enacted by, my parents when they would whoop me and stuff like that. And I'm sure a lot of Black folks got that belt, that coat hanger, that slipper, that shoe, whatever you got. You get what I'm saying? Everybody got whoopings, right? But we have to remember that a lot of that came from the plantation, right? And a lot of Black folks were whipping their kids because that's what they thought the white man taught them to do. And once again, that goes to the overall thing. We accept generally as people what the prevailing norms and notions in society are. If we think it's okay, to hit kids, most people will hit their kids. If we think it's not okay, we don't do it, right? Hopefully, if I do have children one day, I won't whoop them. I won't hit them. I'll just shake the shit out of them. Anyway, nostalgic narratives of this nature romanticize the slave family as a refuge, a shining light of Christian values, cleanliness, and moral fortitude amid the brutal commodification of Black reproduction. Some former slaves worried, however, that the moral lessons they took from family life during slavery were lost on a new generation of Black Americans. For instance, more than a few former slaves expressed concern that religion had lost its meaning among Black people. 85-year-old Prince B insisted that religion meant something during slavery, unlike post-slavery times when religion became full of so many empty words. Other former slaves suggested that empty words were the least of Black Americans' problems. Dave Harper told his interviewer of a time when the Ku Klux Klan burst into his aunt's church during Sunday service and beat the people over their heads with pistols. The people went out the doors and windows. Without religion, former slaves prophesied, young Black people would walk through life without a moral compass. Pinky Howard lectured her interviewer on how young folks ain't got no manners these days. Another former slave complained, I don't know what I think about young Negroes today. They is all shined up and going around. If they can read and write, they ought to know the difference between right and wrong. I don't think they will amount to much. Some of them ain't got no sense. Sounds just like what I heard growing up. Man, these new rappers today, they don't know what they talking about. These young boys coming around the block with their gold grills and their gold chains, Cuban links and stuff, they just want to be seen. You get what I'm saying? It's always the same, copy and paste. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. And yeah, man, it's always so funny how hypocritical the dominant society is. White folks tell black people, y'all need to be more moral. Y'all need to be fathers in the home. Y'all need to stop having, premarital sex and teen pregnancies and all this sort of stuff. Meanwhile, the KKK was kicking down church doors and telling people that we're trying to live moral, ostensibly good lives, preventing them from doing it. So hilarious. Continuing here. Concerns that black religion have become little more than empty words, that young African American people lack sense, and that white terrorist groups could disrupt church gatherings at will worried former slaves. They insisted that black parents must strive to teach their children to overcome both the historical legacy of slavery and the racial and sexual violence that swirled around black communities in Jim Crow America. A former slave known as Uncle Jackson insisted that his parents provided him the best education a black man could have to meet these challenges. Jackson's upbringing made it possible, he argued, not only to survive slavery, but also to successfully navigate through the brutal world that Southern whites policed during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Jackson began, they lays a heap of stress on education these days. But education is one thing and fireside training is another. We had fireside training. I would have told that old Negro, boy, you got branded. Don't talk to me about education. Don't talk to me. Because I hate when the old folks, and I have no respect for the elderly if they're disrespectful to us. You get what I'm saying? Because we standing on business and we're trying to educate ourselves and fight for our rights. You get what I'm saying? I hate when old folks say, y'all don't have no fireside training. Y'all don't have no common sense. You get what I'm saying? I hate that. I hate that. I'll disrespect an old person. I'll spit in the old man's mouth in a minute. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, Nelson Moreno says, hey, Louis Farrakhan. Shout out to Nelson Moreno right here. Shout out to Nelson Moreno. We just reading books, man. We just out here reading, trying to learn, talking about slave breeding, baby. Anyway, other former slaves expressed similar sentiments. One former slave quipped in despair, I sure don't know what this new generation of N-words coming to. And Henry Jenkins, who claimed he was instructed early in religion, insisted that there's not much to a boy, white or black, that don't need a whooping sometimes on their way up. Okay. In slavery, as in freedom, many African-American parents reportedly gave their children a whooping to instill in them the importance of observing America's prevailing racial etiquette. In slavery, racial etiquette meant displaying unquestioned subservience to the wishes of the master, mistress, and overseer, be it sexual or otherwise. And what passed as freedom at the turn of the century, displays of subservience seemed even more important. Joseph Badgett recalled how little things changed before and after the Civil War. Badgett, who claimed his mother had Indian in her, had a tendency to fight and was the pet of the white people, spoke of how former slaves needed to be mindful of their subservient position in American society in the years immediately after the Civil War. I used to say master myself in those days, Badgett recalls. He insisted that deference to white people was a commonly accepted part of life in the late 1860s and early 1870s. He added, I remember the time when I couldn't go nowhere without asking the white folks. I wasn't a slave then, but I couldn't go off without asking the white people. Let's go to Nelson Moreno in the comments. He says, nah, you got to give old people a pass, especially if they're broken down. I'm sorry, but physical discipline ruins black families. Give old people a pass. I think some old people deserve a pass only if they're like crazy. Like if you can look in their eyes and tell like their brain is gone, okay. But if you're an old person with generally your functions, but you still want to be disrespectful to a new group, a new crop of people, and, and this goes for any race or ethnicity, I feel like respect goes both ways. You don't get respect from me just because you're old. You might get more disrespect because you're old and you didn't do nothing with your life. So fuck you, old nigga. I don't give a fuck. So yeah, that's what I think. And I want to keep that same energy for me. If I ever get old and I ever start being disrespectful, I want Gen Alpha to say, I'd spit in a millennial's mouth, straight up. So yeah, it goes both ways. You got to give respect to get respect. You get what I'm saying? Nelson Moreno says, I'm sorry, but physical discipline ruins black families. I generally agree. I mean, we shouldn't be hitting our kids for the very same reason we shouldn't teach our kids to be Christian. That is the white man's religion. Those are the white man's practices. We shouldn't be teaching our kids to worship no white Jesus the same way we shouldn't be whooping them with belts. And sometimes those things happen in the same day. Sometimes those things happen in the same day. You go to church, you worship white Jesus, you come home, your mama and your daddy's whooping on you for something you did. You get what I'm saying? Anyway, continuing here. Violence loomed just as large, if not larger, in Black life after the Civil War, thanks to the rise of the KKK. The outbursts of violence and brutal punishments that once shadowed Black people in slavery now lurked ominously in every corner of the South, day and night, in the form of the Klansmen. Where former slaves recalled avoiding the wrath of the plantation overseers or conforming to the demands of the slave master during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Klan terrified Black Americans into submissiveness. The former slave Boston Blackwell testified, "Them Ku Kluxers was terrible. What they done to people. Oh God, they were bad." Another former slave recalled, "I sure did keep out of the way of the KKK. Folks would see them coming and holler out, 'The KKK is riding tonight. Keep out of their way or they will kill you, surely.'" Other former slaves recalled the constant threat that the Klan posed to the family home. For example, Marilda Pethy blended her memories of sexual exploitation and family separation during slavery with a commentary on the Klan. The KKK come and run the colored people away from home. Many a colored woman came to mother's house in the middle of the night with clothes covered with ice and snow to the waist and carrying her baby in arms because they ran her away from home. The Klan's impact on Black Americans varied as widely as had relations between the slave and the slave master. Some former slaves, like Charles Dorch, insisted that, "I don't remember much about the KKK. They never bothered me and never bothered anyone connected to me." Responses of this nature likely reflected the caution that elderly former slaves exercised when talking to white people about race and slavery during the era of Jim Crow segregation. I mean, that's the same as like what Black folks do today. When white folks ask you, "Hey, how was your trip to Europe?" Do you want to give them the right answer or do you want to give them the white answer? When white folks ask you, "Hey, what do you think about this new job?" Do you want to give them the white answer or do you want to give them the right answer? When white folks ask you, "Hey, what did you think of my potato salad?" Do you want to give them the white answer or do you want to give them the right answer? The code switching that we do as Black folks is not only about language, how we speak properly in some situations and how we speak in a more relaxed way, closer to our accents, wherever regionally that is from, when we're by ourselves or with family and friends. It also goes to what we say and what we don't say. And so, yeah, former slaves saying like the KKK ain't never bothered me. I'm chalking that up to a type of code switching, right? Anyway, continuing here. Dorch was therefore not alone in hastily dismissing questions about the Klan. Melvin Smith, for example, emphasized how the N-words is better off since freedom come. Asked about the Klan, he responded, "I don't know nothing about that. I hear something about it, but I never believed in it." Similarly, some former slaves hastily disavowed any knowledge of the Klan. One declared that the Klan never bothered his town, while another remembered avoiding the Klan by keeping his mouth shut. Many former slaves, however, testified to the terror associated with the Klan, insisting that they kept the N-words scared plumb to death. Like the poor white trash who worked as overseers during slavery, Klan members brought violence into Black family or community life for any number of arbitrary reasons. One former slave spoke to the Klan's presence in almost mystical terms, claiming the KKK sprung right up out of the earth. Carrie Bradley, whose pa was a stocky Guinea man and whose mother was a rain-bony and tall woman, recalled the utter terror that invaded family life after the abolition of slavery. Bradley remembered, "I was scared to death of the KKK. They came to our house one night and I took my little brother and we crawled under the house and got up in the fireplace," she continued. "They knocked about there a pretty good while. I was afraid of the KKK more then than I ever been about snakes." Of slavery, former slaves recalled the emotional pain that was associated with the violent separation and sale of family members. After slavery, fears of family breakups remained, but the forces behind those fears were domestic terrorists, white men in sheets, who would sooner rape and kill the inhabitants of an African-American home and then set that home on fire. It's tough to read this stuff, but it's very important that we read it because it's important that we know our history, right? Once again, this is why this is my favorite chapter in the book, chapter 5, is because we're actually hearing the voices of people that were enslaved, which is so hard to find. Of course, there are slave narratives, like the official ones, like Frederick Douglass, et cetera, et cetera. But these are people that were not the well-educated, lucky Negroes who were able to make it off the plantation and become prominent Americans and public intellectuals. These are the people that, experienced it, saw it, witnessed it, and now they live to tell the tale. Conclusion. The language former slaves used to construct personal narratives about slavery and slave breeding echoed the rhetoric of 19th century abolitionists and confirmed allegations of slave breeding by amateur historians, Black scholars, and African American playwrights during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The narrative synergy is striking. Despite their varying political, intellectual, and cultural objectives, the narrative and rhetorical representations of slave breeding between the 1830s and the 1930s emphasized the significance of sexual violence, racial violence, and family separation. Former slaves described these elements of slave breeding sometimes candidly. Their firsthand narrations of breeding practices present an understanding of the past that was virtually absent from professional history writing during the early 20th century. Like early 20th century Black scholars and playwrights, former slaves narrated episodes of violence and/or coercive breeding practices that underscored what they felt was an immoral social and economic system. For former slaves, though, the narration of memories about slavery evinced a certain degree of continuity between the past and the present. Just as former slaves recalled the white slave trader, master, and overseer as sources of past terrorism, exploitation, and sexual violence, so in the early 20th century did they narrate tales of the reinvention of the slave system in the form of sharecropping, lynching, segregation, rape, and the separation of Black family members. In other words, the narratives that former slaves presented to WPA interviewers were not simply recollections of a long forgotten past, but were memories with lived meaning. As the sociologist Herbert Bloomer once argued, meanings are social products that are formed in and through the defining activities of people as they interact. For former slaves, the slave past was contextualized by and bled into the Jim Crow present. To former slaves, the memories of slave breeding were as real and vivid as the threats of Klan violence and local lynch mobs. These were the historical and sociological facts of Black life in America. Facts that professional historians and lost cause mythologizers denied. But as the African American historian Lawrence Dunbar Reddick observed in 1937, all facts are not included in any history. Those which are selected do not select themselves. They are chosen and ordered by the historian with reference to some frames of ideas, purposes, and philosophy which he has in mind more or less consciously. Black scholars and playwrights knew this all too well, so too did former slaves. Going back here to facts being in quotations, some people might say, okay, the academics are getting too woke. They're getting too woke. What are quote unquote quotation mark facts? You get what I'm saying? Facts are social constructs. I mean, there are certain things that we understand to be facts, like the sky is blue, the sun is yellow, and stuff like that. But yellow and blue are social constructs in and of themselves. Their meaning is constructed through people's agreement on what blue and yellow is, etc. Right? So without getting too philosophical here, the facts of slavery are the understandings and meanings that we derive from what we have learned from it, from interpreting the narratives that are left behind and the actual amounts of people that were trafficked and the amount of wealth that was generated, et cetera, et cetera. The facts of the case are that slavery existed, right? That is a true fact. The fact of the case is that slave breeding existed, et cetera. But the facts are meant to be interpreted and constructed, right? So continuing here. Former slaves knew as well as any Harvard-trained African-American historian that more often than not, demographic and economic data sets obscured more than they revealed about slavery's brutalities. The former slaves felt empowered enough to actively narrate violent sexual abuses at a particularly violent time in America's history, suggests that while they understood the links between the past and the present, they were not willing to passively accept lost cause mythologizing or the professional white historian's erasure of them from collective memory. As the descendants of former slaves took up arms and fought for freedom and liberty during World War II, The historical assertiveness that simmered in early 20th century Black scholarship, drama, and the narratives of former slaves burst forth on the American political stage. The emergence of the modern civil rights movement changed America forever. But in bringing about social, legal, and political change, the leaders of the civil rights movement from the late 1940s to the end of the 1960s recognized just how important it was to contextualize their efforts within America's history with slavery. As we will see in the following chapter, the themes long associated with slave breeding, racial violence, rape, and family separation were vitally important to the protest narrative of the civil rights protests. For a young and increasingly well-educated generation of African Americans, it was time to learn from the lessons of their enslaved ancestors, stand up, start marching, and demand change. All right. So we're going to continue here with chapter 6. That was the end of chapter 5. Let's go to the comment right here from my guy, Nelson Moreno. Nelson Moreno says right here, hold on, by the way. I want to make sure my camera looks good. All right, let's make sure my camera looks good. Nelson Moreno says, I'm the product of careful and purposeful slave breeding with the intent of creating a super being, a wise creature who can be at two places at once, who can see the future. I'm the ultimate N-word. Okay, that's a bit of trolling. You got to be trolling a bit. But to some degree, I'm the product of slave breeding as well. And if you're a descendant of people who were enslaved, you are definitely the product of slave breeding. There was no consent under slavery. So anybody that was born under rape, even if the master didn't directly rape us, right? There was no consent under slavery. There was no consent under slavery. We have to understand this. I mean, that just makes, that goes without saying, right? So yeah, I don't think the breeding actually has good benefits now, other than just our existence, right? And I believe our existence is good, or if at the very least neutral. But we weren't bred to be, superhuman. We were just bred to sort of exist, right? Because, they got the biggest, strongest bucks to have sex with as many Black women as they can on different plantations. But the goal would have just been to have any old Black body there. You get what I'm saying? Like, they thought it was nice and funny, and maybe there is a chance the baby will grow up to be strong and tall like Pa or Ma. You get what I'm saying? But the point is just to have a slave, at least, a Black person there. So remember, it's Ramadan, so bear with me. I'm running on like fumes. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm hungry. I didn't eat today. I've just been reading all day, studying and stuff like that. So yeah. Nelson Moreno says Drake looks like a bad experiment. That's pretty funny. That's pretty funny. I mean, if anything, if slave breeding did work, Drake would be the most successful bred type of the product of slave breeding. Became hella successful, rich, famous, etc. Right? I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the slaves that were bred directly from the master. White people had sex with their own slaves to sell their own children, right? And so, yeah, a lot of the people that we look up to as abolitionists and fighters for Black rights were the product of, the master breeding his own slaves. And so Frederick Douglass, for example, he was a half Black, half white person, right? And so, yeah, he is what could be considered like a successful product of slave breeding, right? But let's continue here. Sex, violence, and the quest for civil rights. In slavery and in freedom, the historian Daniel McGuire argues sexual and racial violence functioned as a tool of coercion, control, and harassment. African American women understood this basic fact of American history better than most. The constant threat of rape that followed Black women in slavery and the incidences of sexual violence, kidnapping, and sexual assault after slavery ultimately inspired the civil rights movement. In the popular imagination, the civil rights movement began with the Montgomery bus boycott during the 1955 and 1965. In actuality, the movement was a culmination of decades, actually centuries, of interracial sexual violence that affected the lives of Black women, men, and their families. The civil rights movement was the product of militant race women like Rosa Parks saying enough to the sexual and racial abuses experienced by Black women and their families. They were determined to challenge white America to live up to the democratic ideals it proclaimed to be fighting for during World War II. Black women like Parks, politically determined, race proud, and intellectually brilliant, began a movement for African American civil rights in the 1940s. Going out to the comments here, Nelson Moreno says, "Hey Simon, I'm reading the Dune books and it's slowly helping me understand Islam. Wishing you a fruitful Ramadan." Well, Ramadan Mubarak to you, and good luck on the Dune books. I heard they are as thick as we want Zendaya to be. So yeah, I wish you the best on reading those books and getting through them. I still don't like Dune. I don't know what it is, man. I don't have the urge to read the books, watch any more of the movies. Timothy Chalamet can continue on with his career. Best of luck to him. But what is Dune, man, when we have Star Wars, when we have Star Trek, when we have The Expanse, when we have, Sliders? You know what I'm saying? When we have Jurassic Park, what's the point of Dune? What is the point of Dune? I don't get it. Anyway, continuing here in our book, for multiple generations of Black women since the Civil War, the cult of dissemblance had meant that stories of sexual violence were hushed or kept strictly within close family circles. The objective of such circumspection, as Darlene Clark Hine observes, was to shield Black women from the racial and sexual taunts of white America and to project a dignified countenance to the outside world. But as we have seen in the previous chapters, maintaining hushed tones about such matters when in the company of whites was one thing, but actively forgetting such abuse was another. Indeed, early and mid-20th century Black women and men did not forget, much less ignore, interracial sexual violence. In fact, they confronted it in very public ways. In scholarship, in fiction, writing, and plays, and increasingly well-organized and financed legal and political attacks on the racist and sexist foundations of American society. If slavery's lifeblood was a Black man's physical ability to reproduce children, the segregation of the United States after the war was based on sex, be it the sexual terrorism visited on Black women in their places of employment or the lynching and castration of Black men, which is an interesting take to have. The civil rights movement was spurred on by Black people tired of getting their dicks cut off and getting molested at work by, bosses that they, had, right? Mama went to clean the white man's home and daddy keeps on trying to reach up. The man of the house keeps trying to reach up under her skirt. We're sick of that. We're going to sit on the front of the bus and we're going to break down segregation, right? Going to Nelson Moreno in the comments, he says, Dune is like Kendrick and Star Wars is like Drake. One day I'll break it down for you. I get where you're coming from, man. I know Dune is deep. I just really don't like the idea that Leto, the thing about Dune is that Leto, the emperor, god king, whatever, right, planned out everything that happens over 1 million trillion billion years or something like that, right? And he turned into a worm and he's supposed to be like a prophet. And there's also mystical prophetesses that foresee the future and shit like that. I don't like that type of sci-fi because number one, I don't believe that's how real sci-fi would ever work. Because I think sci-fi should reflect a plausible future or a plausible existence in our universe that's unknown to us now. The thing about Dune, it becomes space wizardry. Even worse than Star Wars. Some people say Star Wars isn't sci-fi, it's just space wizardry, which I would kind of disagree with. I mean, aside from the Force, everything else in Star Wars is generally plausible. Tell me if I'm wrong, but everything else in Star Wars could generally happen in the universe. Lightsabers, intergalactic battles between giant spaceships and stuff like that, that's real. But never once in Star Wars does the Emperor say, I've planned out the 1,000 years of Sith rule. You get what I'm saying? That's not real for me. But explain to me why you like Dune. Make it make sense for me. So during the years that former slaves provided WPA interviewers with their reminiscences about slavery and slave breeding, African Americans stood on the verge of both challenging and changing America's racial landscape. In an era defined by Jim Crow segregation, the sexual assault of Black women, the terror of lynching, and the anxieties associated with an unprecedented economic depression, Black Americans were on the move. This movement was literal, metaphorical, and political in nature. African Americans migrated out of the South in the tens of thousands, heading primarily to the North in search of employment and sanctuary from Southern racism. Black workers, shunned by white labor unions, formed their own organizations and pursued better work conditions and pay. A growing Black middle class joined the Urban League and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and fought against segregation, interracial rape, and lynch mobs by bringing their cause into American courts and the halls of political power. And Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association both inspired and divided Black Americans on how best to oppose American racism and assert their pride in being the sons and daughters of African ancestors. In the decades prior to the second Brown v. Board of Education, a 1955 decision, which decreed an end to educational segregation with all deliberate speed, and Rosa Parks' now iconic and mythologized decision to sit defiantly in the white section of a Montgomery, Alabama bus, African Americans engaged with the memory and legacy of racial violence and sexual assault in ways that shaped the rhetoric, politics, and protests of the civil rights movement during the 1950s and 60s. This chapter considers how the public narration and politicization of these memories were woven into civil rights discourse between World War II and the concluding years of the 1960s. Prominent civil rights leaders, such as the most prominent of them all, Martin Luther King Jr., viewed slavery's most intimate abuses as part of the lived reality of Black America's intellectual, cultural, and political history. In publicly addressing this history, Black men, women, and children strove to force Americans to confront the darkest aspects of its past so that it might change the Republic's future course. So basically, people were bringing to light more and more about the issues plaguing Black folks, our condition and stuff like that, right? Because Black folks were moving to the North. Some were becoming the bourgeoisie, middle class and stuff like that. Organizations were forming, social organizations for Black improvement and stuff like that. So, the only way we can make our case for more improvement, more inclusion, more benefits, more rights in society is if we talk about the negative things that brought us to this point in society. Go in here, Nelson Moreno says, don't watch those breakdown lore videos. They ignore Islam and other religious aspects. One day I'll break it down for you, and I guarantee you will be filled with clarity and epiphanies. I think, what's great about Dune? Nelson? It draws from this other book that's really powerful and important, and it's called the Quran. It's a very cool book called the Quran, and also Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, like other books that really explain Islam. I don't know, maybe you've heard about this book called the Quran that breaks down Islam really well. I don't know if I need a white American man who wrote a science fiction book about giant dick-eating sandworms to explain Islam, right? I think, the book has like merits to it, right? And I'm sure the religious overtones are lost on a lot of the white Americans who do the breakdown videos on Dune, right? Because they don't understand Islam. You get what I'm saying? Or have any clue about it, right? They just see, sand, natural resources, people in robes and thobes and stuff like that. But break it down. Put it in the comments. We got plenty of time. I'm going to be reading for the next hour or so. I'm going to be on live reading this book. So you got time to get your shit off about Dune in the comments, and I'll try to respond to it as best as I can. You feel me? But let's continue here. So at the end of World War II, the Social Science Institute at Fisk University declared that one of the most important race relations jobs of the next 10 years will be the full integration of minority group veterans into a post-war world. During the next 2 decades, the members of African American institutions of higher learning, Black churches, and grassroots political organizations took up the cause of full integration. For World War II veterans and all African Americans, Mary McLeod Bethune exemplified the drive for full integration when she called on civil rights activists to come together and keep their rendezvous with life. This rendezvous, Bethune believed, would result in African Americans enjoying the rich fruits of democracy. For the vast majority of Black America's civic, religious, and intellectual leaders, the fight for legal equality was a way to attack the historical legacy of slavery and to challenge the nation to live up to its founding ideals. Black churches throughout the South played a critical organizational role in addressing the historical legacy of slavery.